I'm really excited about this launching and glad to have you here. This is, I want to tell you just a little bit about Write the Record and about this new project. So Write the Record aims to do just that, to write the record. And what does that mean? That means some things have been told incorrectly, some things have never been told at all. So we're here, Write the Record is here, and our purpose is to put some of those, correct some of those things that have been told incorrectly and add those things that have not been shared at all. And if you go on our website, you'll see some of the work we've done. It includes getting things like portraits of people from the community in our courthouses, in our courtrooms. We've been very successful with that. We did a plaque project for the 200 block of Davis Street, which was the black commercial district during segregation. And we didn't want to lose those stories. So we have put plaques up on several of the buildings. The plaques don't by any means tell all the information, but there's a QR code on the plaque which goes to a web page that's sponsored by the town of Culpeper's tourism department. And you can get tons of information there. So this is a new project for Write the Record. And there's a couple of pieces of Write the Record that are absolutely mandatory. One is documentation. We don't put stories out there that we haven't documented. And the other thing is, it needs to be public. You can't just keep it in your living room or in your church. It needs to be public so that that information becomes more widely known and becomes normal. We want to normalize things about our history that we haven't known. So having said that, there's a lot of different mechanisms, vehicles to make those things public. And I thought, well, let's start doing some podcasts. Let's start getting stories out there. So this is called Stories That Make Us Smarter. And the whole idea is to, in an entertaining way and all factual, please come in and have a seat. We're sharing stories that maybe you have no way of knowing. You weren't told, they weren't shared with you. And so now this is a new venue. This particular one tonight is called We're Related How? Okay, so all the information I put out in advance was meant to be a little intriguing. I didn't want to tell the whole story because it's really not my story to tell. I'm just here as a facilitator. So I want to get into that, and our first guest I'll bring on board in just a moment. But the whole idea is we have two special guests. One is a lady named Anna Davis from Pennsylvania. Anna descends from the union of an enslaved woman named Lucinda Wormley and her slave holder named Blucher Hansborough. And Anna has done, along with her family, a great deal of research. I was at a banquet last night, and her sister showed us a book, if you can call it that. It's a manuscript. It's 500 pages of generations and different lines that came from that union. Our other guest is a gentleman by the name of Jim Stearns, who's come to us from Colorado. And Jim descends from a man named William Hansborough, who was Blucher's uncle. He's a white man who lived in Culpeper County back in the early 1800s. And Jim descends from William. The interesting point there is that William never married. So we're going to hear their stories and how they came to be related. And I would like to invite Anna Davis to come up as our first special guest. We give her a round of applause. So Anna is in Culpeper because for the first time in 12 years, the Hansborough-Wormley triplet family reunion is occurring this weekend. And so Anna is a big part of that. They laughed last night. Anna calls people and says, I think I might be kin to you. So anyway, I met Anna many, many years ago. And Anna, tell me a little bit about what you know about your ancestors from Stevensburg.
I've been doing research probably since about 1982, and that's actual research on my family history because I really didn't know a lot about it. In fact, my grandmother, who was born in Brandy Station, died in 1925, and I was born in 1942, so obviously I would not have known her. My mother shared some stories, and sometimes you wonder whether stories were not told because of pain or lack of knowledge. But I knew a little bit about some names like Blucher Hansborough. I knew that he was a slave owner, or as one relative says now, the more proper word is enslaver, and that my great-great-grandmother, Lucinda Wormley, who lived on that plantation at Coles Hill, where we were today, had 8 children by Blucher Hansborough. Now, how does that happen? And you know, I really wanted to know more about that story. Here's a young woman, probably in her teens, as we could, you know, determine, having one child after another with basically no life. She had no power, and so she had these children. And that's, you know, to answer your question, that is the beginning.
And did Blucher Hansborough give those children his name, his last name? Were they able to take that name or not?
Well, let's say, you know, this is the way people debate this issue all the time, and you have family who would, you know, want to say, yes, he definitely said these were his children. We don't know that.
Okay.
But the children did carry his name. At one point, several of the children still carried the Wormley name, but eventually they were all Hansborough children, but with a different spelling. His was Blucher Hansborough, and the descendants that I'm familiar with are the results of that union were Hansborough.
That's not uncommon, that there's a slight letter difference in the name. Now, was Blucher married to someone else?
Oh, yes. He had his wife, and he had three children, 2 girls and a boy. So these were children outside of that legal union.
Those children, have you done any research in their descendants?
Yes.
And have you made connections with them?
Yes.
How did that go?
That went, for the most part, there was only one instance, and this was during probably 2 family reunions ago, that I contacted someone, and you contact through Ancestry by messaging. And I contacted this person, a male, and it was the day of the reunion that I spoke with him. And when I said, I'm your cousin, 4th cousin, but a person of color, then there was a pretty negative response. But for the most part, those who I have contacted, one who was trying to get here, Rosemary Cash, who was a direct descendant of Blucher, white, not mixed. We have maintained a relationship for a number of years. And Blucher also had a sister whose great-great-granddaughter I contacted through Ancestry. She lives in Wilmette, Illinois, is a researcher herself, and we have maintained contact, and I've maintained contact with her son and his wife.
Excellent. Now,
Yeah.
just so that the folks listening to this understand, when you say Ancestry, you're talking about that big genealogical site on the internet called ancestry.com.
Exactly.
And you did your DNA, is that correct?
I did.
Is that how you found some of these connections?
Oh, a lot of the connections I have found through DNA, some through research, but more recent DNA, which has been wonderful. And just to familiarize you with this, Ancestry, I would say 12 to 13 years or less has been the time that DNA has been available to us. And it's very interesting what you find, because now when I look at relatives who may show up as a result of, you know, the union between a slave master and a slave, some of the white relatives who show up, I look and see what their DNA makeup is, because it's not always 100% white for them, and they don't know it. They may have 1 or 2% of whether it's Nigerian or Ghanaian, but they may have a history that they're not aware of, or carry DNA that they're not aware of.
Well, and that's sort of the difference here, because it's not uncommon, I'm going to say this and you can correct me if I'm wrong, it's not uncommon for descendants who are people of color to find that they have connections to white people because of things like the union between Blucher, Hansborough, and Lucinda Wormley.
Right.
It's a little less common for people who are of European descent to find that they may have an African descendant, an African ancestor, somebody of African descent. But I want to get back to Lucinda Wormley for just a moment. Now, Lucinda Wormley didn't die until the 20th century. 1918.
And which was interesting because she died during the pandemic.
Yeah, flu pandemic.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay.
And I thought that was kind of unique, because my grandmother, who would have been her, Lucy was my grandmother, who was named after her probably, died in 1925. And when I looked at her death certificate, it showed a chronic problem over a 7-year period, which goes back to 1918.
Right.
And I thought that was interesting. So she also was impacted by the pandemic.
It just took longer.
It took longer.
So with Lucinda, and you and I have talked for 12 or 13 years about where did Lucinda's roots originate, and that name Wormley, where did that come from?
There were 2 brothers in Virginia. They were 2 of the largest planters, the wealthiest planters in Virginia, or among the wealthiest planters. And they were Ralph Wormley and his brother. I surmise that Lucinda, because when she was in some census mulatto, and then some census beef or black, depending upon the census taker, but I surmise that she was bought by Peter from a Wormley plantation, because how else would she get the name Wormley?
Well, and where were the Wormleys? Where is this Ralph Wormley?
I'm not clear on this, but is it King and
Queen County?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Or down in the northern neck somewhere?
Yes.
Okay. And that would have not been uncommon. Peter, Blucher's father, and Peter, his grandfather,
Right.
were from closer to that northern neck area, King and Queen County. So it very well could have been that she was bequeathed as part of a dowry to someone who's married, or it could have been a purchase. But we're still trying to figure that one out, right?
That is the question.
You and I have talked about going to those courthouses and seeing if there is some kind of deed or some kind of evidence of a transaction that we could get back even a little bit farther to Lucinda Wormley.
And see, this is very hard. It's a very difficult process for African Americans to track that history, the slave history, because, you know, at some point slaves were just considered chattel or property, so there were no names. They were listed as property, or if there were names, eventually it would be maybe a first name. So it's with no other information and an age, possibly. But it's very hard to track that information.
Well, it is, and the records sometimes are there, but they're not indexed. I mean, you can't go in a courthouse and look for Lucinda Wormley.
Right.
You'd have to look for a Ralph Wormley and see if he, maybe in a will, he listed a Lucinda.
Right.
Maybe.
Right.
And I've had some luck with that, but it's random and it's very difficult.
Yeah, and you know, sometimes I think about the fact that there would be those who would not want to identify all that they owned within a will. I mean, you just don't know what people's thoughts are or were when they were preparing, you know, their estate information. You absolutely, we don't know.
Right. Well, you do get a situation if somebody dies, and they have several children. You've seen this in wills, that they will leave to son David, Lucinda and her 3 children, and name those 3 children.
Right.
That's a good part of the research story.
Right.
It doesn't always exist.
Right.
Sometimes when somebody dies, the enslaved people are just go in one lump sum to another person, maybe the wife or one of the children or whatever. So it is a difficult task, and that's why, I mean, you and all the other family members who put together these reunions every year, well, not every year.
Yeah,
you were doing it every 2 years, and then COVID hit, and then, so it's been 12 years. But the amount of work that you've done has just been phenomenal. And part of the whole write the record and stories that make us smarter is because this is a history that impacts us all. I'm just hoping that, you know, people in the Culpeper community, but it's not limited to the one particular community, that they know their community better.
Right.
They know about Stevensburg and things that happen. Now, this whole story is about somebody who you found out was kin to you. Now, how did you find out that Jim Stearns was kin to you?
Well, you know, I'm trying to, I have pretty good recall, but, you know, Jim might challenge me on this. But Jim read an article from, I believe, from a Mainline Today magazine that was done by a particular writer who interviewed me for this magazine. Jim happened to have read this magazine and then contacted me, found me. However, he probably found me like I find people too. And we need to be working a little detective agency together. But anyway, Jim found me, contacted me, and I then got back to him.
Okay.
And so that's how this relationship started.
Okay, and we're going to stop right there, and we're going to bring
Stop right
Jim up
there.
here.
Okay.
Jim Stearns, would you please come and join us? Okay, thank you, Jim. Thank you so much for being here. And we do understand that you and Anna are related. Can you tell us a little bit about how you came to believe that you and Anna Davis were related?
The story of our investigations of family history, boy, the way I told it last night, it sort of has no beginning and no end. So it's kind of like if you were explaining football to an alien, and you started by saying, well, there's a bunch of guys that jump on a fumble, right? Where do you start? So my brother, I want to shout out to my brother David, who's back in Colorado. He couldn't make it here, and I'm here for the Hansborough reunion also, through a very generous invitation from Anna and Mary, her sister, who's right there. And my brother David Stearns, I'm Jim Stearns, and when we were growing up, it was always my father's genealogy, Stearns, 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 very patriarchal. Well, around 10 years ago, my brother started exploring the maternal line, my mother's line. And if you think about it, you've got 4 grandparents and 8 great, 16 great. I mean, it mushrooms up, right? It's almost like there were more people alive then than there were now. It kind of that's my first brain explosion. But so following from my mother to her father to his mother, my great grandmother, to her father, and then his mother, is this wavy line going through 4 generations. My brother was kind of stuck on Mary Ann Hansborough Garnett, and he's on Ancestry, and he puts his picture out there. You can do that. I mean, we're both white guys, right? You can, apparently. And that's what we thought. And he gets a message from a woman he's never met, Beverly Evans. And she says, "What are you doing in my family tree?" And they started a conversation, and she has now passed away, but she sent him, amongst other genealogy reports that she had done, the William Hansborough's will. And so we learn now where Mary Ann Hansborough Garnett's father was William Hansborough. He was, so then, how do I continue? Okay, in the will, we found that he freed his, a woman that he referred to as my mulatto woman, Betty Packer. And together they had 4 children, and he freed them all in his will. My third great grandmother, Mary Ann Hansborough, Philip Hansborough, and we have a descendant of Philip, who I just met this weekend, Anya, and Katie and Eliza. So the 4 children, he freed them in his will. Okay, that was 1837, 22 years before the Civil War. He was a wealthy plantation owner, and with Zan's help, I thought he was living up here in Stevensburg, but turns out, no, he had a large plantation down on the Rapidan, on Willis Ford Road, we're pretty sure now. And so going back from William to his father, Peter, we tried to track where is Betty Packer from. And there is a reference in William's, Peter Sr. was William's father. All right, not in his will, I believe, but in his inventory of property was Betty Packer. So somehow her origin came through his father. But we
Jim.
don't know if she was a product of his father or not. We just don't know.
Right. Let me just interject here a little bit
Yeah.
and ask you some questions. So your and your brother David's research, you established that you were descended from William Hansbrook,
Yeah.
but William didn't marry.
No.
And you found that out. So did you do your DNA?
Yeah. Yes.
And what did the DNA tell you?
Well, yeah, and I was going to say, unlike Blucher, William did not have a white wife or white family. In fact, the rest of his brothers apparently disapproved of his lifestyle because he was living openly, really, with this woman and his 4 children, and he was quite proud of them.
Right.
So William, as it turns out, is Blucher's uncle. So that's how we're related.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
I wanted to get that in there. Now the DNA question. Yes, I've done my DNA, and I would urge everybody here to do it. It's not a deep state conspiracy. You just submit it to Ancestry, and what you get, a very interesting thing is they have something called through lines, and the through lines will give you kind of a family tree with the DNA matches. And as it turns out, I've got several DNA matches in common with Anna and Mary, but not enough DNA in common to actually match with them. But we match with relatives in common, so we know we're connected. And then my DNA would show 1%, 99% Scotland, England, whatever, European, but 1% from Benin, West Africa, and Togo, Benin and Togo. And so that confirms the genealogy that we found on paper. Because if you count down if Betty Packer was half, then Mary Ann would have been a quarter, and so on and so forth. And I'm about 1/128.
Okay.
So but that's the DNA analysis
Right.
that confirms it doesn't, and it can confirm relationships. So I think it has with Anna and I.
Right. Jim, that's really helpful. One of the things when Jim shared the story with me, and Anna shared some of the story as well, correct me where I'm misspeaking here, but it seems to me that Philip, the oldest child, was born about 1805.
Yeah.
Okay. But William did not free Betty Packer, or sometimes referred to as Parker, and his 4 children until about 1821 or 22. So that was a puzzle to me. Why would he as Jim said, all the records show that he openly acknowledged these children, which was unheard of and illegal to have children, interracial relationships. So what I discerned is that when William, and you help me out here, when William's father died, Peter Sr.,
Yeah.
he died in 1820. And in that will were Betty Packer and all these children. They were owned by William's father. And therefore William could not free them until after his father died and he inherited them. And then he did free them. Now, didn't he also set them up in the Free State of Ohio?
Yeah, there's a lot there, and I can respond to all that.
Tell us what you found.
Yeah.
I'll make, for those of you that don't know, the state of Virginia said that if you were freed after 1806 and you were freed from being enslaved, you weren't born free. But after 1806, you had 1 year in order to leave the Commonwealth of Virginia. If you did not, you could be re-enslaved. Some people would file a petition, and if they had the support of other people within that community that said, oh, this person is elderly and they're not capable of moving and they're of good character, then they could sometimes be petitioned to stay. But for the most part, you had to show the court, if you wanted to free someone, you had to show the court that you had the funding and the plan to remove them from the Commonwealth of Virginia. And the two primary choices were Liberia or Ohio. Ohio was the closest free state. So Jim has done some exploring out there in Ohio where he knew they had settled. What did you find?
William did not free his Betty Packer, his woman, or their 4 children until his will, and that was in 1837. So I don't know what the gap meant, but he openly traveled with them, and he had, we know that he had an account at the local grocery store, for example. The kids could go shopping there. He would settle up the bill at the end of the month. He sent Philip to school, and he got good marks. We have a deposition stating that. William knew that his will would be challenged because he was leaving everything to his kids and to Betty Packer. And yes, it was challenged, and it's filed in Chancery Court. We have dozens of depositions explaining that his love for those kids and how he traveled with them and how he cared for them and how they looked just like him, so on. Now, in around 1825, I think he started to travel to Ohio sometimes with Philip, and he started buying land up in Ohio. And if I have the timing right, if my brother was here, he'd correct me. But he bought a couple large parcels of land, and he knew that he was going to move his family up there when he died. He just didn't know when that was going to be. So I have been to Ohio once. I'm going again, and what they established after 1837, or starting in the 1820s actually, when some of them moved up there earlier, a very successful black pioneer farming community in Highland County, Ohio, southern Ohio. And they had many acres, and they had about 100 people living there. I think the homes were maybe log cabin. They established a school and a church. And my brother met Katie Burwinkle, a historian from Highland County, and since then I've met her and John Glaze, and they work for, they're connected with the Highland County Historic Society. And this cemetery, the settlement dispersed in around 1910. I guess people just sort of were successful and they moved away. And the settlement was abandoned, and all the wood was sold. The houses were, torn down, and the church and the school were sold. The wood was sold. The only thing that remained was the cemetery. And he had deeded, Philip Hansborough, who kind of ran the settlement, had deeded land that he owned, a half acre to the church on which the cemetery stood. Okay, so we were told that, oh, that's on private land, there's no access, the owner's kind of ornery, you can't get back in there. I hate to say it, but I did get back in there. And I met a kindly neighbor who said, oh yeah, just go back in there. So I wasn't quite sure where the boundaries were, and I don't know that I really wanted to know. It took me 2 days, and I found a glimmer of a stone or something, and I discovered the 7, I think 6 of the 8 graves, or 7 of the 8 graves. Betty Packer's grave is there, and it says wife of William Hansborough.
Wow.
So there's another indication, and Philip is buried there along with his wife. And I am now involved in an effort with, we've hired a local attorney because we feel that that deed to the church is still viable. it just got subsumed into modern day deeds in around the 1940s. Not the current owner didn't know anything about it, I guess, when he bought it. So they just kind of forgot about the church and took the land. And so the attorney says they don't own that land. So we're going to go to court. If they don't want to settle, we'll go to court and try to establish that we are the rightful heirs of that church. My fourth great grandmother's buried there. So we have a case. And what I would like to do is preserve it and restore it and preserve it and make it open to the public. And because I feel that this is my next project, is there are a lot of settlers, there are a lot of current residents in that area that have to be descendants of that settlement.
That's
And
fascinating.
we just have to find them.
And I wanted to ask you, while you're on the question of finding that settlement, I wanted to ask Anna, do you have any research in your line of people that went to Ohio?
Not from Blucher's line, but again, with this history in this county or this area, on my Blucher-Hansborough, the first child born from the union of Blucher-Hansborough and Lucinda Wormley was a Rose Hansborough rather, who married a Warner McGuinn. He also was a mulatto, and he was what my mother termed a free issue. And that meant that if you were a free issue, your mother was white. And so with that, we know that he, it was a long time before I knew anything about his siblings. I knew about one, Lucy McGuinn, but there were two others. And he had a sister who went through West Virginia and wound up in Oberlin, Ohio. He also had a brother named Jerry McGuinn, who for some reason changed the spelling of his name from M-C-G-U-I-N-N to G-W-I-N-N and wound up in Ohio near that area.
That's amazing.
And so I did find, we knew nothing about him. He was a mulatto. My great-grandfather McGuinn married a mulatto married a mulatto. They had children. The children from that descendancy married other spouses of color, had other spouses of color. Jerry McGuinn goes to Ohio, a mulatto, and marries white. So all of the descendants from that relationship were white, or at least 99% white, because they did carry some of his DNA. And one of the descendants from that line lives in Arlington, Massachusetts. She's in her late 40s. She was going to come this weekend, but she's going to come and visit my sister and I by the end of the summer because her mother now wants to meet her relatives. And she lives as white, and she's from that, that background.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about that, because we're talking about the term passing.
Right.
And I mistakenly came upon a conversation one time at one of the other reunions where people were talking about passing, and I thought somebody had died. And that was not the issue. It was, if you could pass, would you? So both of you all have experienced at least knowing people or being part of families who have some black ancestry, but through intermarrying with other mulattoes and then with white people, it came to the point where you could pass for white. Now, is that a case where you would move to another location so that people who knew you as an African American person wouldn't deconstruct your story? I mean, what is your knowledge of that?
Okay, I had knowledge of a relative, the husband had a cousin, and this cousin lived in Philadelphia, in South Philadelphia, which is pretty much had been in the past an Italian stronghold. When he would visit this relative in South Philadelphia, it was always at night because there was fear on her part that her ethnicity would be revealed. And so I think that, I don't know how much, but it certainly has happened in a lot of instances where people have passed and further their education opportunities, not wanting, knowing that they had privileges. You know, if we really look back at the history with mulattoes, some came out looking just about white. I mean, our great-grandfather, my sister's sitting there, we have a picture. If you see him, you would say that's a white man. Now, with that, then you have to make a decision, I would think, at that time. Do I, as this mulatto who looks white, do I continue in this circumstance of servitude, or do I look at the opportunities that are there for me because of my skin color?
Well, not just your skin color, it's all your features,
exactly,
everything.
Skin color, hair, features, and all of that.
Right.
So then you would then say, yes, there would be those who would take advantage of those opportunities.
I think that gets us right to Jim and your story.
I can add to that.
If you can go back to William and Betty's daughter. Her name is Mary Ann?
Yeah, my ancestor, my great-great-great-grandmother, Mary Ann Hansborough.
Right, and she was enslaved in the Rapidan area,
Yeah.
and a young man
Want me
from
to
a
tell a story?
neighboring farm
I'm happy to tell it.
whose last name was Garnett. And for those in Culpeper County, you might recognize that name. Very prominent, very wealthy family.
Yeah, at one
Okay.
point I was told they owned half the county. Horseshoe Farm down on the Rapidan was a Garnett property, and there were 4 other homes down there. So they were in somewhat close proximity, and this is partly what, through Zan's knowledge of the local area, she really kind of convinced me to look down there for where William lived. So the Garnett, James Garnett, was the son of Reuben. I'm not sure if he was at Horseshoe, but he was in one of the homes. Anthony Garnett was his father. James Garnett gave up his entire inheritance and fell in love basically with Mary Ann Hansborough, the daughter of William and Betty Packer. And they ended up moving to Ohio. And in the will, the Garnett will, he basically said, "You're getting nothing. You're all set," you know. And so they went off to Ohio. They got married up there and had 3 kids. One of those would be my second great-grandfather. And so right from the start, she's marrying, well, her mother married white. She didn't marry white. Her mother had children with a white plantation owner. She married the son of a white plantation owner. And her son Travis, he married his cousin, and so Travis would have been what they used to call an octoroon, 1/8. He married his cousin, Eliza's daughter, who was also 1/8. So there was a little bit of an infusion there. Their daughter, my great-grandmother, was Minnie Garnett, and if you look, we have these old family pictures, and if you look, you can kind of tell. And so maybe that little bump led to a little more infusion of might say, black DNA. Okay, after that it was white, 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 and so that's where I am. But I think there's an element of, I guess that would be one way to escape the hardships, would be marry white.
Well, I think the story, if I understand it, is that your ancestors eventually did pass for white and moved from where they were living to.
And we don't know. See, this is what's amazing about it. Like I said, my father's genealogy was always front and foremost in our family. My mom's story was never told. We don't know how much she knew, and we don't know how much my maternal grandfather knew. I mean, he would have known his grandparents, and you would think somebody would have known, but we were not. No, there wasn't a family story that was told, and so I do feel like, in a lot of respects, this whole endeavor to explore and to establish my family history in this arena is I'm doing it for my mom, and that's just how I feel about it.
So then the two of you got together, and so it's interesting to me, and maybe to those that are listening, you all have kind of joined forces and embraced one another. But Anna grew up as an African American. You grew up as a person of European descent.
Typical white guy. Yeah.
A white guy. So finding out for you, Jim, finding out that you had a person of African descent.
Yeah.
How did that impact you? I mean, you're a grown man now, so I don't know if you'd known earlier. You said to me yesterday, I wish I'd known earlier.
Well, if we'd have known earlier, my feeling there was I would have asked my mother and my grandfather about it. And I think we would have gotten a lot more information.
Well, if you'd known earlier and maybe been subject to that tragic rule, the one-drop rule, you would have been classified as a black man.
I literally am one-drop guy.
So
Anna will tell you that some people might say I'm one drip, but I'm really one drop. And,
but it was a law, and whether it was a law where you grew up or not, I don't know. But I did read something about it, which I want to share with you all. But before I do, how can you imagine how your life would have been different had you been classified as a black man?
Well, I don't think I can really imagine. But yeah.
Anna, can you imagine how his life would have been different?
Well,
we grew up in a white suburb.
How would his?
I don't think we had a single black family living there.
Well, you know what? I can say this. My husband has a friend, Jim. This might have been your experience. He has a friend who's our age.
What?
Who worked for an American corporation, big job in an American corporation, and he knew my husband from many years before that, and this was in California, if I recollect the story. And so Jerry, my husband, met with him, and this guy's name was somewhat changed, but he also said, basically, I don't want anyone to know who I really am, because he was passing for white. So I think here it is 2023, and if Jim were, let's go back to 1960 or before that, how would you feel knowing that what we know now, and me responding to you, yes, I am your cousin.
Yeah.
When
I first met Anna, or found out about Anna and Mary, I guess my attitude, I just kind of rolled with it. It didn't explain mysteries that I didn't know. It wasn't a big shock. I just was like, okay, it is what it is. And again, my mother, I felt like I was exploring my mother's line, and it was just, we were just going to follow it where it led. But yeah, the reason my family didn't talk about it, We lived in a upper middle class white suburb of Milwaukee, and maybe they just didn't want people to really know. And, you know, if I'd have known, I don't know, I might have kept it quiet. Honestly, I really don't know.
Well, you know, I think when Jim and I met the first time,
Yeah.
it was funny. I have to tell the story. We met at it's a local place where everyone goes for breakfast and lunch.
Yeah.
And we were sitting outside, and it was towards the end of the afternoon, and they were getting ready to close. So a waitress comes out, and I don't know how that happened that we mentioned that we were cousins. Oh, we said, could you take a picture of us? We're cousins. And she looked and she said, oh, and it was at the end of the day, and we said, why don't you sit down? We'll tell you about the story. So she said,
Yeah, I remember it slightly differently.
oh yeah, she said, but didn't remember we
Well,
said,
Anna was saying, guess who this is?
yes, yes.
And, you know,
And after that,
I felt like she was showing me off.
yeah, well,
Like,
yes.
This is my white cousin.
Yeah, I was curious because I'll tell you one thing, and I can say this, you always say the truth when you can say it. Jim has been one of the most honest experiences that I've had. Because he's a good human being. It's not just about color. It's the essence of who he is. And that's more important.
I appreciate that.
Okay, and that's for all of us, black, white, Asian, whatever. But it's the essence of who he is. And I think that's why we're becoming, and we've gotten close as family. Even though, I mean, he's one drop, that's okay.
Well, I can confirm that with, I mean, it's just, I feel so accepted and by Anna and Mary and this whole family, you know, and it's just, I've been to the reunion and have met so many people, and everybody's just wonderful. And it's such a tremendous group of people.
Now, let me just share this. Jim and I were talking as we were sitting before we came here and, you know, up on the stage. And we were talking about, you mentioned about going someplace and you were the only white there.
Jamaica. That was several years ago, and I got off the plane, and you're surrounded by everybody's black, you know, and it's like, oh, this is how it feels, you know. So
yeah, so
that was a revelation,
and
that was long before I knew any of this.
Yeah, and there's a comfort issue.
Yeah.
Whereas
yeah.
as African Americans, we've had experiences where we're the only one, and you deal with it. I mean, you don't even. It's just, you know, it just is. So.
Well, and I think that's the message of this story, is how you all have come to accept these things. And it's, Jim, you've come to accept that you are part African American.
Yeah.
And Anna has come to accept you as a relation.
Yeah.
And I think it's important for the community that hears this to understand how you all have embraced this moving forward, as you said, Jim, moving forward to find out more about Betty Parker, her cemetery, but also to come to grips with how things were and how these kinds of things happened. They were not isolated situations. And some people would like to say they were isolated situations, but in looking into the one drop rule, I came across something that I wanted to share, and I found it on the internet today, trying to see which states actually adopted the one drop rule, and most of it was done after the Civil War. Virginia looked at it in 1853, and here's what they came up with. Although the Virginia legislature increased restrictions on free blacks following the Nat Turner Rebellion of 1831, it refrained from establishing a one-drop rule. When a proposal was made by Travis Epps and debated in 1853, representatives realized that such a rule could adversely affect whites, as they were aware of generations of interracial relationships. During the debate, a person wrote to the Charlottesville newspaper, "If a one-drop rule were adopted, I doubt not if many who are reputed to be white, and are in fact so, do not in a very short time find themselves, instead of being elevated, reduced by the judgment of a court of competent jurisdiction to the level of a free Negro." The state legislators agreed. No such law was passed until 1924 in Virginia, apparently assisted by the fading recollection of such mixed familial histories. In the 21st century, such interracial family histories are being revealed as individuals undergo DNA genetic analysis. But in 1853, the powers that were understood. They knew that if they did a one-drop rule, it was like, uh-oh. And my brain says, how would they know? Without, I mean, what do you have to prove something? So,
well, I feel like it's an American story. You know, there's probably a lot of people with the same story as me who may not know it, or if they do, they may not want to know it. They may not want to acknowledge it. But it's certainly true, and the DNA shows it, and the genealogy shows it, and all the documentary record shows it. William was not a saint, my ancestor. He had 64 slaves, and he freed maybe 12. So I think he felt that some of his field hand slaves were not ready. So he was no saint. You know, he was part of that culture. And, but he just, there was another comment that he favored the sable skin. And I read that somewhere, and that was one of the comments. So I think he really, because he not only, Betty Packer had another 4 children from a fellow slave, enslaved man. And he also freed those 4 children in his will. William did. So he not only took care of his kids, but her kids from a previous relationship. And that, to me, just says he really cared about his family and Betty. And then when you look at her gravestone and it says wife of, I mean, I think it's a beautiful story, but then you have to look at the power differential.
right.
She couldn't really refuse. So there's always that too.
I think Anna has a,
Now, you know what has always, if I weren't as old as I am, I would love to write a book that addresses this. And I always wanted to do it in the voice of my great-great-grandmother, Lucinda. Because here you had an enslaver who repeatedly had children by her. For whatever reason, was he attracted to her, or for many, many different reasons. But what has happened with, and I think it speaks to problems in our society now, what has happened, and this is, always the pain with me, Lucinda had siblings probably, but she was the chosen one by the enslaver. So then she has the benefits inside the house. The children are, there are gradations of color, but the children, many look closer to the whiter side. Her siblings may have had relationships too, but with other blacks. So here you have the divide within a family. Those who have, and the other thing that has always troubled me, and I'm very outspoken even with white friends about this, and that is that Blucher had a wife. And here's the power that the white woman didn't realize she had. She had no power because she couldn't vote, she didn't work. And here was an enslaver, her husband, who was bedding with, a slave. So here she could have joined forces with, and that would not have happened, with some of the slave women and said, I'm not going to tolerate this. And she would have joined forces and there would have been power with it between the women. But I think what happened that is kind of a natural occurrence, she's home during the day. Other enslavers' wives may have experienced the same thing, various plantations in the area, and they commiserate about what's going on, and these wenches who are having children by their husbands. Not that their husbands, they're not made to feel responsible, it's the wenches, okay? So what happens then in terms of racism continuing to fester generation after generation, the children, her children, young children who are probably home with her and are not of school age, they hear her venom, and that starts some of the problem. And I want you all to really think about that, because I think that has had an unbelievable negative impact on all of us, because none of us are free from what happened in the past. None of us.
Anna, thank you. And that sounds like another podcast.
Yeah, well, it is.
So what I'm going to do now, I want to thank you both very much, but hang on to your microphones, because we got to take a few minutes for the videographer to get set up. I'm going to come down where you all are, and I'm hoping there will be questions or comments that you all would like to make. And you can ask them of Jim and Anna.
Okay, some of you might wonder why the situation with Jim and my family is so unique when you see that today happening. The uniqueness is that it traces back to the enslaver and the enslaved. And today you find people marrying or having, relationships. But here, and a cousin of ours, we think, wrote a book called Coming to the Table. Called Cousins. And her comment is coming to the table where the enslaver and enslaved family sit down together and express their feelings. And that's where we're at, and that's one of the differences today, is that our history is different from what you're seeing today. My own daughter have married people who were not of color, and it's not unique. But again, so it sinks in. The uniqueness is that when we think about William or Peter, they were our enslavers. But here we are today.
Right. Okay, we've come some distance.
I think this story is an American story. I read a book, and you all might want to look it up. It's by James McBride. It's called The Color of Water. And his story was, he started in Virginia as a white boy. His father claimed Italian. He had a restaurant in Alexandria, Virginia, his father did. This lady would come and work during the summer. They thought it was a helper. Come to find out, that was his black grandmother. When his mother and father got divorced and they had to move to where the grandmother was, on the Trailway bus, his father tells them, when we get to wherever they were going, Chicago, Detroit, whatever, you're going to be little black boys. And they had grown up white their whole life. I think this is a story of America. It might just be a Southern story, but if we dig far enough, I think it's all of our stories. And I admire you all that you did this much research and that you're proud to tell it.
This experience with our family here is vastly different in a lot of ways than what we have seen in the past. And I, like the lady behind, I would recommend you read Annette Gordon Reed's book about Monticello. Now the record is very clear, the public record is very clear that there was for many years, the Jeffersons and the Hemmings were not reconciled. And there was a lot of misgiving, misattribution, denial, and it spilled out into the public because of Jefferson's prominence in this state, in this Commonwealth. And it's a tribute to you two folks on the stage for what you have done and what you have demonstrated to us in the way you have approached this quest that we all should give you due respect and props, because what you have done is outstanding, and it is not something that you will always see in our society, the way you have approached and handled this, and we all should think about that.
Thank you, thank you. It takes a lot of courage, I think, to accept the truth when it's uncomfortable, if not painful.
So I want to say it's been a great pleasure, having this entire experience. It's been just a great pleasure with meeting Mary, Mary Lightfoot and Anna Davis, and also Jim. I found out a wealth of information, digging into the family tree is, like was said before, is a true American story. And all of its complexities, there's multiple complexities in it, and really understanding that and accepting it for what it is. But, the importance of it being the stories being told, there's one thing to do your ancestry, right? But there's another thing to really understand the stories behind what makes you who you are.
That's exactly.
And
Makes us who we are.
Us who we are, and accepted.
We are collective. We are a collective body of people.
Exactly, and it's also important to say that, like when we're saying colorblind society, that's actually not the right thing to say. We should all see each other for who we are and accept our differences for, who we are. And that's how we learn to be in each other's presence and learn from each other.
And respect each other.
And respect each other that way. Yeah, absolutely.
And then Anya, this is your daughter?
This is my daughter, Aspen Little. Yes.
Well,
she's
and
7.
it's so important that the younger generations know these stories. And a lot of times they don't.
They don't, right? Because also a lot of the oral history has not been carried down. There's also a lot of the stories have been some shame, right? Just kind of Jim's story. Jim is actually my direct cousin, nothing removed. We come from the exact same, and we have the exact same ancestors. Unlike, I'm related to Mary Anna through his nephew, and that's on the white side. And I wanted to be related on the black side. It's like, who are the Africans? I want to know. And really, my search for this within this genealogy family tree is I really want to know the stories of the Africans who, my African ancestors who went through these lands, Virginia. Slave states. What was their experience? And who are they? What are their names? And not being just reduced to just an age, someone just on a paper, And this is just this is a phenomenal uncovering. And I'm just so blessed to have met multiple family members. And it's just been a true honor.
Thank you.
So this is a question and a comment. So I am of a few generations under cousin Anna and cousin Mary, and I grew up which also welcome to the family, honey. I grew up hearing these stories, and it's been definitely a blessing. I grew up hearing about the Hansborough family. I'm a Frank's descendant, which is one of Lucinda's sons, and we grew up coming to Culpeper as children. We grew up hearing the stories of Lucinda and of Booker, and we grew up hearing of Peter and his family as well in the book. I was like looking through, but also I guess, and it's been definitely a blessing because in the more I travel, the more I speak, the more I realize that not everyone has this family information and has such understanding of where they come from and who they are. So it is definitely a blessing. And as we go into the future, and we are giving this oral history, and we have such great books, and we're having these conversations, what would you two like to see for the future generations to do? Is there? I don't know if you've had time to really think about it, but especially Jim, as you're finding a lot of this information out recently, and I know Cousin Anna has been on this journey for years. But what would you like to see for the future as we are widening our family tree, and we're finding more cousins, and we're bringing more information into the fold as far as property and travels, marriages, and all of these things? What would you like to see for the future generations, and what would you like for us to do besides we know we'll carry on the legacy? Of course, we plan on doing that. It's been beautifully set by you guys. What else do you feel like we could do to continue this?
There are any number of things. As my sister shared with you, both my nieces are married to white. And this to me is so very important with interracial marriages, that the kids know both sides, embrace both sides, and embrace both histories. And I think it's important I remember when my great niece Ariel was born, her dad is Russian Jew. I went crazy going to Har Zion and to get a mezuzah blessed and to start reading more about Judaism. You know, in fact, my nephew-in-law said, "Boy, you're learning a little more about Judaism than I know." I said, "Because it's important to me, it's intentional. We can't solve problems unless we become intentional." And for young people, I think it's important to know your roots. You can travel, like when young people say, "Oh, we're going to have a family reunion in Bermuda." Well, do you know your family history? Do you know, this was a great experience when out there today at Len Park, you could look and see Coles Hill, and you can feel the history, and you can look at the landscape and say, wow, what happened here? You know, what would it have been like for me being enslaved? And every black person was not enslaved, and every white person did not own slaves, because everybody didn't, they may have had one or two people working for them, but they weren't necessarily enslaved. So the notion that you had a state full of enslavers, that's not necessarily true. And we have to really learn our history, the entire history. And so I think that's going to be important, but it's going to be important for young people to carry the baton, know their history, know from whence they came, and then what to do with that information. It's like with slavery, and I'll say this, and I feel strongly about this too, and I've told white friends this. We have nothing, one of my friends recently, I've said, we have nothing to do with the past. She wasn't an enslaver, I wasn't enslaved, but we have a lot to do with what happens now and in the future. How we vote, what policies we support, and being intentional about everything we do going forward. And that is, do I get an amen on that? Okay. Okay.
Thank you, Anna. Jim, did you want to add something?
I could add something. Yeah, I think the recent attempts to sort of cancel or bury Black history because it's uncomfortable, I think is perhaps a huge excuse, but it's a tragedy, and it should never happen. And hopefully that trend will be reversed. I would like to see I wrote a letter to Senator Brown from Ohio because apparently there was a law passed, he sponsored a law to help preserve Black cemeteries. and they're back in the woods. They're on private property, but they're being lost and in disrepair. And so the national park, that bill passed, and the National Park Service is supposed to administer it, and it just needs funding. And so I'm hoping that actually helps the Hansberry Cemetery in Ohio as well. I wrote them and said, put us on the list. Other than that, I think we should, perhaps someone should write a novel or perhaps a movie about the Hansborough family.
I've never been to Culpeper ever in my life. I don't even think I ever heard of it till recently when she was talking to me about it. Today at the family reunion, last night was awesome, but today at the family reunion, several times, Miss Anna, asked me, how are you enjoying yourself? She was asking me my feelings and things of that nature. And as I got to meet family that I've never met, people talked to me, and I found out, not knowing this, that where the family reunion was at, the land close by was the actual land that the ancestors were slaves on. That just internally took me to a whole nother level, and I got a hold of Anya, and me, Anya, and two brothers, I think is it Eugene and his brother, and we took Eugene far out.
My uncles.
Yeah, we took Eugene far out where he could privately tell us who was what land, and explained it all. And it was just a very emotional thing. And in my mind, I'm thinking, I come from that. My ancestors were in bondage on this land. The land is beautiful, but they went through a lot to very strong people. And I don't know, I could have did it, probably not. I'd have just crumbled up because, I'm in a different era. And yes, we have struggles, but nothing that they went through. So I'm just humbled by the whole experience, and glad that I got the opportunity to actually be a part of it, to see it with my own eyes. Never could imagine that I would see or be in a place where my ancestors actually were slaves. Like, I'm just still, I don't even know how to put it into the right words, but very grateful to have that experience. And that's what I would say.
These are the things that I'm thinking about, okay? I mean, I've known a bit about our history, but my question is directly to you, Jim. Your brother, thank God, he found out the history of your mother. But what was your perspective of people of color, of black, before then? Because this is the thing that we deal with. Now, I'm happy to have you in the family, okay? I'm enjoying you. But the thing about it is that there are so many people that don't know from whence they come. And they feel that they're at a different level. And I'm just saying, considering the perspective difference from finding out now, has it changed from your perspective of what you thought to now?
Like I said, I grew up in an all-white suburb. I really didn't have any black friends growing up, and even into adulthood. I really, maybe at work, a few, but more like acquaintances, not really close friends. But so I really didn't have a solid place to come from where I really didn't have any definite attitude, I would say, about it. And when my brother found these things out, well, I just rolled with it. It didn't explain some great mystery. It wasn't a shock. It was just, okay, it is what it is, and this is my mother's family, and I'm going with it, you know, because it's real. And that's really all I felt about it, yeah. And something drove me, though, to make contact with Anna after I read Freeing Charles. And Scott Christensen had already passed, I guess. I didn't know that at the time, but he died in a fall at home. But he wrote the book, and now I'm finding myself reading everything I can. I've started to read the book about T.O. Madden right here in Culpeper. We Were Always Free, I believe it's called. There's another book that I really found amazingly fascinating, was The Bone and Sinew of the Land. It talks about hundreds of black pioneer farming settlements in the Great Lakes states, in the Northwest Territory. Slavery was outlawed, but the black laws came in, and life was not easy. So, I mean, and Hansborough settlement is mentioned in there, but not described in detail. And there's another book called All in the Same Spaceship. Then it has a specific chapter about Hansborough settlement. And so it's really an honor, like, to find this. I don't think on the Stearns side, there's nothing written about, there's no history, but all of a sudden I'm finding that there is a body of literature that describes my mother's side of the family and this particular history. And so it's just, I'm still, kind of brain explosion. So that's kind of where I'm at. Yeah. But I am very grateful, and I'm just proud to be here, telling this story. And I think it is an American story, but I don't think we're unique. Like, I think another thing for the future, like you asked, Ann, would be, and I think Eugene Triplett said this too, get to know your relatives. He grew up with all his friends around him and neighbors, not knowing that they were all related. And you can find out through DNA, but you can find out through genealogy, or family stories. But I just think it's really important to know your family and your extended family history. I just think that's really important.
Thank you. And I thank you all for coming. I do want to tell you that the things I've heard from the answers that Anna and Jim have given and the comments that you all have made, that we are on the right track with Write the Record, because it is extremely important for all of us living today that we completely understand, to our best ability, our collective history. So I thank you. Watch for when we post this online, and we'll probably get a lot more comments, hopefully. Okay.
Thank you, Dan.